The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Cooper on what a $15 minimum wage would really mean for America's workers. Philip Wolgin on building an immigration system that lives up to American values. Plus, Bill Press with Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan on why Biden needs to go big with a stimulus relief package. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Progressive Democrats have made raising the minimum wage a priority for the new administration. And for good reason. David Cooper says a $15 minimum wage would lift pay for tens of millions of workers and help reverse decades of growing pay inequality. And we say hello to David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute. David, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
And nice to have you with us. Your organization has done remarkable work advocating for the $15 minimum wage. Part of that is to document the widespread benefits if this were to happen. First of all, how many people would see a bigger paycheck?
Yeah, if we were to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 by 2025, which is the schedule that's been proposed, we estimate that 32 million workers throughout the country would get a raise. That's a little more than 1 out of every 5 wage earners in the country. And just to clarify a little bit, we estimate that about 22 million of those workers are folks that would otherwise be paid less than $15, so they're directly going to get a raise. And then there's about another 10 million workers who are folks who would probably be earning just above $15 in 2025 anyway, and they're likely to get a raise as well as employers adjust their overall pay scales to leave some distance between folks who have been there for a while and folks who are new on the job. So in total, 32 million workers, about a fifth of the workforce.
And by your estimation, how will this change the numbers of people who now live below the poverty line?
Well, it's gonna lift a lot of folks out of poverty. We ran the numbers and we find that there's about 6 million workers who are currently in poverty that would get a raise from this bill. So that's about 60% of all the working poor, all those that are employed that are currently in poverty would get a raise from this bill. It may not lift all of them above the poverty line, but it's going to help a lot. Other studies that have looked at this have put the number at somewhere between 1 and 2 million that would be lifted above the poverty line. So a really substantial chunk of folks that would be lifted above the poverty line because of this.
And it's certainly a great place to start. I mean, it may not achieve everybody or everything that we want, but it's certainly some place to start, and it's long overdue, of course. At the individual level, what would an increase from today's minimum wage to $15 actually make a difference on a worker's life?
Yeah, I mean, it would have a substantial difference. It would make a substantial difference for a lot of folks. And again, I'll put some numbers on this. We estimate that raising the minimum wage to $15 would send an additional $107 billion to low-wage workers, into low-wage workers' paychecks each year after the bill was fully enacted. So for an individual worker, the average affected worker would see their total annual income go up by about $3,300 a year. Now, that may not seem like a huge amount, but for someone who's only making, $25,000 a year, an extra $3,300 could go a long way. I mean, that's a significant increase in their spending.
Before we started the interview, a couple of us were talking and looking at the different states around the country and where their minimum wages are. And And it's just sort of mind-boggling when you look at all the different states that are sitting way down here in the basement, and just thinking, well, gosh, I mean, this is just a horrible way to live. And I thought, even if they got a buck, so if you go from 725 to 825, you're going to be gleeful. You're going to be so happy, and yet you're still way down the ladder of where we should be. It's astounding that more people aren't on board for making this happen and making it happen fast.
Yeah, and the truth is, there's a lot of folks. I mean, we need $15 right now, frankly. I mean, there's a lot of folks. We have a tool on our website called the Family Budget Calculator that allows you to look at how much it costs to have what we would describe as a modest but adequate standard of living anywhere in the country. You can enter your zip code and it'll give you the numbers. And we find in that tool, the data show that there's not a single place in the country where a single person can achieve that standard of a modest but adequate standard of living without $15 today. So, unfortunately, we could use $15 today. We're talking about raising it to $15 5 years from now because you have to give some time to make those changes to allow businesses to adjust. But getting to 15 in 5 years, it would be a huge improvement for a lot of these folks, as you noted. But you make a good point that even that is not going to be enough in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm. Your organization also has data on how raising the minimum could reduce growing income inequality along racial and gender pay gaps. Why is that the case?
Well, it's the case because typically women and workers of color are disproportionately represented among low-wage jobs. This is the result of, decades, if not centuries, of historical discrimination, what economists sometimes call occupational segregation, just sort of only allowing these disadvantaged groups to go into certain professions that have been underpaid due to racism and sexism for many years. And so as a result of that, when you raise the minimum wage, you're going to shift more income. You're going to raise wages more for a lot of women and workers of color who have been disadvantaged for so long. So when we look at the numbers of the 32 million workers that would benefit from a higher minimum wage, women are the majority. It's 59%. So just less than 60% of all the workers that would benefit are women. Workers of color would disproportionately benefit. So of all Black workers, about a third would get a raise as a result of this bill. About a quarter of all Hispanic workers would get a raise as a result of this bill. More than a third of all Black women workers would get a raise as a result of this bill. So, these are measures that are going to lift up these particular groups of folks more than anyone else, mainly because workers of color and women have been disproportionately represented in these low-wage jobs for so long.
Absolutely. And much long, as you pointed out at the beginning of that answer, much longer than we would really care to think. We're speaking with David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute. And David, as we were recently reminded, of course, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is doing its own analysis of the impact of raising the wage. Their latest report contained some points of agreement with the Economic Policy Institute. In what ways does that report support your findings?
Yeah, so, CBO's report, in their analysis, they agree with us that raising the minimum wage would lift wages for millions of workers. By CBO's estimation, they put the number at 27 million workers, so a little bit lower than us. But they estimate that this is a policy that would raise wages for a huge chunk of the workforce. They also they also say that raise the minimum wage would lift about 1 million workers above the poverty line. So they agree with us there. They also note that doing this would provide governmental savings in programs like the Supplemental Nutrition Program, the SNAP program, food stamps, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, these public assistance programs that a lot of low-wage workers are forced to rely on because they don't make enough on the job. It's gonna lift some folks up, allow for them to not have to rely on those programs as much. That's gonna generate some savings in government programs. CBO notes that as well. And so, I think that CBO's report really bolsters the case that this is a policy that would be beneficial. The other thing that's interesting in that CBO report that just came out is they also note, and we have stated this, that raising the minimum wage is a good tool to fight inequality. I mean, they note that a lot of the financing of these higher wages would come from folks at the top having to pay a little more in terms of prices, and businesses who have been making record profits in a lot of cases having to shift some of those profits into wages for workers. So really interesting finding there, CBO being explicit that the minimum wage is a tool to fight inequality.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, I mean, the wage gap that has grown, in the last 50 years is, I mean, I don't understand why a CEO needs 20 million and 10 million is not enough. I mean, that's just it's kind of crazy to me that that's the case, but that seems to be what it is. Now, of course, on the other side of things, there were some key differences between the CBO report and the analysis provided by the Economic Policy Institute. How significant are these differences?
Well, so the primary difference in CBO's estimation with ours and frankly with a lot of folks is that CBO takes a much more pessimistic view of the likely job effects of a higher minimum wage. And this is the question that's always raised, that opponents of higher minimum wages always float, that somehow when you raise the minimum wage, it's going to cause massive job loss. And this is a topic that has been studied just enormously in the economics literature. And most of the more recent literature tends to show that higher minimum wages tend to do exactly what they're supposed to do. They raise wages for low-wage workers with little, if any, impact on jobs. But for some reason, CBO has decided that they've actually changed their jobs impacts to be even more negative than they were before. For some reason, between 2019, when CBO last studied this, and today, CBO has decided that that raising the minimum wage would lead to more significant job loss than they estimated previously. We don't really know why they made that choice, given the fact that there's been even more research that's come out over the last 2 years, which has again indicated that higher minimum wages tend to have little, if any, impact on jobs. So we disagree significantly with them there. But again, what's interesting is that even if you take CBO's report at face value, the overwhelming conclusion is that this is a policy that's going to do a lot more good than any potential harms. Particularly, if you tend to discredit or think that their jobs impact estimations are wrong, as we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's something that I didn't understand about that CBO report. Look, when you're paying people more money, they have more money to spend, and so the cycle continues, and it just and when they're spending more money, a business can hire more people to do jobs. So that I've never understood that argument, and I still don't get it, and I certainly disagree with it. The fight in Congress to raise the minimum wage is obviously a work in progress. Who are your key allies, and are you hopeful actual progress can be made?
Well, there are a lot of folks who are working on this, and really the people that should be given the most credit are workers themselves, who have been out on the front lines, going on strike, calling for higher wages. Obviously, the Fight for 15 has just been instrumental in changing people's attitudes around the minimum wage. I mean, I remember back, I think it was 2010, when workers first walked off the job in New York City to call for a $15 minimum wage, and folks looked at them as if they were crazy. And now today, $15 is the standard that lawmakers, policymakers are calling for, advocates are calling for, and so there's a large coalition of folks that are fighting for this at this point. How hopeful am I? I'd say I'm more hopeful today than I've been in a long time. The fact that the president has taken this up as something that he cares about and a policy that he wants to see changed. And congressional Democrats passed a $15 minimum wage bill in the House last summer. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere in the Senate. And it's unclear how things are going to play out this time around. But the fact that we are hearing it talked about a lot at the highest levels of government is certainly encouraging. And not only that, the fact that you've had states, the most recent one being Florida in this last election cycle, where the voters themselves, 60% of the voters in Florida elected to raise the state minimum wage to $15, And this was in a state that went for Donald Trump. So that tells me that there is enormous appetite for higher minimum wages among the voting public. And it's really just a question as to whether congressional Republicans are going to get out of the way and start to respond to the will of the voters.
And, you mentioned 2010, and if I'm not mistaken, that was the last time there was a federal raise, and it's been up to states and since then to raise the minimum wage.
2009, actually, even longer than that.
Even worse than I thought. And in fact, in the last 30 years, I think there have been
right.
two stretches of a decade or more where there's been no movement. And I think, if you just do it incrementally, a little bit at a time, this doesn't hurt anybody. It only helps people.
Well, that's absolutely right. This is actually the longest time we've gone without an increase in the federal minimum wage. The previous record was in the 80s. And one good thing that's great about the bill that's being proposed in Congress right now is that it would fix this problem. What it would do is once it gets to 15, it would do something called indexing, which would automatically adjust the federal minimum wage every year thereafter based upon growth in wages for the workforce as a whole. So we wouldn't have to deal with this problem again. The minimum wage would just be automatically adjusted every year to make sure that low-wage workers aren't falling behind everyone else. And this is actually what happens in a lot of states. I think there's 19 states now that have some form of this indexing where there's an automatic adjustment in the minimum wage every year. I mean, this is something where we could just fix it and then we could forget about it and wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And it's just a question as to whether Congress is going to take action.
We can remain hopeful. I guess that's pretty much all we can do at this point. David Cooper, Senior Economic Analyst with the Economic Policy Institute, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. David, appreciate your time with us today, and would love to have you back again soon.
Sure, my pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how to create an immigration system that lives up to America's best values. But first we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
We can't just settle for disinfecting the White House after 4 years of Trump. A fundamental structural rebuild is necessary, including in healthcare, immigration, environment, civil justice, labor law, and infrastructure. But here's another huge area that must become a priority for a major policy overhaul: the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Quick, name the Ag Secretaries under Carter, Clinton, and Obama, representing 20 years that Democratic presidents had control of ag and rural policies. Few Americans can name even one because, well, what did they do? Even as crisis after crisis ripped through the farmlands and communities they were supposed to serve. Consider Barack Obama's former appointee, who Biden has chosen to serve again, Tom Vilsack. Bizarre, since he actually tried to resign as Obama's secretary, complaining, "There are days when I literally have nothing to do." Seriously? At that time, whole towns were boarding up. Massive hog factories were exploiting farmers and local residents. Climate change was advancing relentlessly and, well, get to work. Vilsack did eventually find something to do. He became chief Washington lobbyist for dairy exporting corporations, drawing $1 million annual paycheck. Meanwhile, hundreds of U.S. dairy farmers are going bankrupt today under low milk price policies he sanctioned. USDA, created in 1862 by Abe Lincoln to be what he called the People's Department, could again become a transformative force for the common good. But our recent presidents have used the position to keep the corporate giants of agribusiness content and in charge. Thus, USDA's top leadership has been indifferent and hostile to the majority of workaday rural people who need an ally. This is Jim Hightower saying, so let's become that ally. To help make USDA the People's Department again, go to rootsaction.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. One of the first actions of the Biden administration was to put a pause on deportation for some undocumented immigrants. Philip Wolgin says it's only the first step toward a fair, humane, and workable immigration policy that must move forward. And we say hello to Philip Wolgin, Managing Director of Immigration Policy at American Progress. Phil Wolgin, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Oh, certainly our pleasure. You know, you recently wrote a column posted at the Center for American Progress on the importance of Biden's Day One executive order announcing a 100-day deportation moratorium. First, what is the stated purpose of the moratorium?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think back up a second to say that one of the things that we saw with the Trump administration that really went into why the Biden administration took this action is just a real attempt to either bend or frankly break all parts of the immigration system, as well as to just frankly break the law. So even in the last few months of the Trump administration, at least twice, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, had to go to court and apologize for, in one case, deporting someone who didn't even get to see a judge, and in the other case, expelling a number of children literally against a court order. So with that kind of illegality as a backdrop, what the Biden administration did on day one is DHS issued an order that did two things. Number one, it said, we're going to do a top to bottom review of literally all immigration policy in DHS to try to get to the bottom of what the Trump administration actually did. And then number two, with that, the only way you can really understand what's going on and make sure that, ICE doesn't, for example, illegally deport someone else is to take a pause on deportations. And so what they said is for 100 days, while we do this top to bottom review, we are not going to deport anyone else. Make sure nobody gets illegally deported, nobody gets deported who shouldn't. It's not absolute, right? There are exceptions for national security, public safety, recent border crossers. But in general, the idea is we need to know what's going on. And the only way we're going to do that is to put the brakes and actually study.
Right. Stop it for a second, take a look and see what we've got, and then go from there. That directive went into effect, as you know, January 22nd, but was temporarily suspended from implementation by a federal judge in Texas. What's the status of the moratorium now?
Yeah. So like you said, Texas as a state sued pretty quickly. They've said basically that they are going to try to sue whenever they can, whether they have a case or not. And unfortunately, in this case, they found a federal judge who was willing to agree with them. So right now, the moratorium is on hold for 28 days while the legal proceedings continue. I think I am at least confident that whether at the district court level or on appeal, the moratorium will be allowed to go into effect. The Supreme Court has said again and again that the administration, that any administration, has really wide latitude to decide how to prioritize immigration enforcement, how to say, this is where we're going to put our limited resources, this is who we're going after, this is who not. And this seems to fit squarely within that. What happens now, we'll see. I will say that during the hearings before Judge Drew Tipton in Texas, the judge really didn't seem to understand that much about immigration policy, hit a lot of very, very basic questions. So I do think sooner or later, we're going to get to the courts that, understand, as the Supreme Court has said, that you've got a lot of discretion in immigration policy and will allow this to go forward.
Is this why they found that judge? Because he just didn't know?
Yeah, it's a good possibility. I mean, this would not be the first time that Texas has, forum shop tried to find a judge. Years ago, they went after one of the executive actions that President Obama took, and they found a district court that literally had one active judge, and that judge happened to have a lot of rulings that were really anti-immigrant, and surprise, that's where they went. And I think this is unfortunately something that we're going to see a lot more of out of Texas.
Yeah, which is a shame. Also, in your recent column, you note that one of the reasons this moratorium is so important is that it will allow the opportunity to, and I'll quote, uncover the full extent of the damage that the Trump administration wrought on immigration policy, close quote. What is your sense today of the damage done by Trump, and what more do we need to know?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I already talked about a few of the cases in which DHS actually broke the law, deported people that they shouldn't have. But I would say that what we learned from the Trump administration, who made immigration and I would say, anti-immigrant actions their defining issue, is that they flooded the zone. They took every available action, threw spaghetti at the wall, and saw what stuck. So, I think some of the earliest things that we saw, and I would focus on one in particular, on the first week of the Trump administration, they basically decided to make anyone here without status a priority for enforcement. Under the Obama administration, DHS really focused on, national security threats, sex traffickers, public safety threats, people who cross the border, pretty recently. The Trump administration said, doesn't matter, if you're here without status, we'll go after you. And what that meant was, and just to take a few cases, they went after a 10-year-old girl in an ambulance after emergency surgery. They went after a survivor of domestic violence in a courthouse. And this was all even before we got to family separation. So, these kind of things really shocked the conscience of the nation. And we just don't really know the full extent of the damage. You can look at any avenue of immigration policy. Certainly, we've talked a lot about immigration enforcement, but you can think of all they've done to the legal immigration system, families that have been kept waiting for years, if not decades, to reunite with their families. They made that worse. You can look at asylum and refugee policy. We really don't have a good sense of the extent of the damage that they did.
And I guess it really shouldn't come as any surprise, given the lead up to the 2016 election in which he basically says Mexico is going to send all over, their criminals or rapists and all these kinds of things. None of this really surprises me.
No, not at all, right? I mean, you could say President Trump was not particularly consistent on many things, but immigration, he made it clear from the get-go, from that day he descended the golden staircase to talk about Mexicans, all the way through the campaign, through the end of his presidency. He was very, very clear that anti-immigrant actions were the main thing.
Yeah. We're speaking with Philip Wolgin, Managing Director of Immigration Policy at American Progress. And Phil, you also write that this moratorium would allow the Biden administration, and I'll quote again, to truly align immigration enforcement with American values and begin to move the nation toward a more fair and just system, close quote. What are the values that should be governing American immigration policy?
Sure. So we like to talk about three things. A working immigration system is fair, it's humane, and frankly, it's workable. So fair in this case means just that. If you've been here for decades and you get stopped, for example, for a broken taillight, the punishment shouldn't be banishment from the country, literally deportation. Right now, we have a one-size-fits-all penalty if you're here without status. It's literally deportation or nothing. So when we talk about fair, we talk about proportionality, right? The punishment should actually fit the crime or the issue. When we talk about a humane system, it's one that, as in the criminal justice system, as we're moving toward criminal justice reform, thinks about allowing prosecutors and judges to have a wide range of discretion. So, to take the same example, if you're somebody who's been here for decades, you've raised a family, et cetera, you should be allowed to take those things into account and not just say, well, you check the box of not being here without status, so you get deported. A few years back, the Trump administration, for example, deported a pastor, father of 4 children from Iowa, because of a 17-year-old DUI. That's not something that I think most Americans would consider humane. And it has to be workable because, frankly, people have to believe that the system will work. I think one issue that we have is we have, a lot of folks on all sides of this issue who think immigration is broken today, right? Whether it's because of the border, whether it's because of the interior. We need a system that everyone can look at and say, yes, I think this is fair. We know what the rules are, and it can actually be enforced. And I think nothing that we have in our immigration system today actually fits that, right? We don't have clear rules. It's a Byzantine system. There are no clear pathways to enter the country. And for people who are here, there's no real fairness. If you've been here for decades, you can still be torn away from your family tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And the woman who is a witness to a crime in Texas and gets deported, and she doesn't even know the country where they're going to send her. I mean, she grew up here. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's a really big issue. But, we've had such a protracted inability to actually make any progress here. All we've done over the past few decades is layer on more and more enforcement, less discretion for judges and prosecutors to take those kind of equities into account. And it's just a system that really, I don't think many Americans believe in at all.
Yeah, yeah. Now, in terms of moving to a more fair and just system, what are some of the specific policies that you'd like to see adopted by this administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've already talked a bit about moving from these one-size-fits-all penalties. And we've written a lot about how you can have a system that really, if you've gotten something akin to a parking ticket in immigration, and I would say being here without status is actually not a crime, it's a civil offense. A lot of people don't know that, right? Then you should get a punishment akin to a parking ticket. So that's certainly one thing. But, we also, in addition to good border management, right, can't just have open borders. But for years, what we've had is a system where you've had need for workers. Frankly, there are sectors like agriculture that have always needed more workers than they can find. People willing to come to this country to do it, but no legal pathways for them to come. And if we think that we are going to be able to just enforce our way out of this problem by either, building a wall on the southern border or penalizing people who are here, rather than fixing the legal side of it and actually creating legal pathways to come, we're never going to get to the right system. So in my mind, what we need is not just to fix the enforcement side, but also think about what are the pathways so that people don't make the choice to come here without status, so that, we know if you're deciding, well, do I come illegally? Do I come not? Maybe I can't come this year through the legal channels, but next year I will, rather than now, which is I will never be able to come legally, and then you make the decision. I'd say on top of that, two things just quickly. The average undocumented person in the country right now has been here for well over a decade. They've set down roots, they have families, they work, they pray, they live beside us. It's time to put them on a pathway to citizenship. It's past due time. And then also the last thing I'll say here, the Trump administration really decimated the asylum and refugee systems. We used to be a beacon of freedom for people seeking help from persecution, from violence. We also used to be a model for the world. We need to get back to that and actually reform those systems.
I was going to add that for some people that are coming here illegally, if we want to use that word, they have a choice. I'm going to stay here in this civil war or potential whatever, this drug-infested area that I happen to live in my country, or I'm going to risk going to the United States illegally. You know which road I'm going to take. I'm going to try and go somewhere where I'm going to be safe, or at least safer than if I stay.
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest differences we're already seeing with the Biden administration versus the Trump administration. Again, the Trump administration's idea was you deal with immigration at the southern border. You don't care about what happened to people in their own countries. When people show up at the border, you try to turn them away, give really harsh penalties. What the Biden administration is doing instead is saying, exactly like you say, if there are conditions in countries, and right now, especially in Central America, that are pushing families and children out, we need to tackle those issues, make it better in those countries so that people don't feel like they need to make the journey, and then also help the surrounding countries, like help Mexico build up its asylum system, rather than just saying we're going to make that choice on our border. And so, one of the things that the Biden administration did last week is start putting in a holistic, what they call regional solution. So you're focused on Central America as a region, building up rule of law, investing in asylum systems, and then also saying, look, for the people that really do come here fleeing persecution, we're going to give them a fair shot at making their case for protection. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think getting in and working with the other countries. I mean, let's answer the question: why are they leaving? Why are they so desperate to leave? Let's figure that out, and maybe we can come up with another solution. Phil, there is, of course, a theme that comes up in debates over immigration that pits the idea of that we are a nation of immigrants against the idea that we are a nation of laws. What's wrong with that way of thinking, and how should that debate be reframed to better serve a more humane immigration system that actually works?
Right. It's a great question. I think if you're on one side of this debate, you can often say we've got to really focus on our immigrant roots. If you're on the other side, you have to say, well, our laws say you can't, do X, Y, or Z, and we have to penalize you. But like I said, if you ask most Americans would tell you our immigration system is badly broken. And when you give people the choice, most people say, well, we're both, right? We obviously have laws. I mean, our nation is founded on this idea of the rule of law, but we are clearly a nation of immigrants. And so to us, again, it comes back to that idea of a fair, humane, and workable system, right? You've got to have a system that is fair to immigrants, that has legal pathways, because we know people are going to try to come here. And so rather than just, bringing the hammer down, we want to bring people into the legal channels. And then it's got to be workable, because again, you want Americans to look at this system and say, yes, I know we've got a system. We've got a system to take care of the border. We've got a system to allow people to come in legally. And then we have a system that says, yeah, if you're here, there will be some consequences, but it's not, ripping parents away from their children, right? That's not at all what I think people see as a humane system. And I think it's actually pretty easy to square that circle. I think those two issues, a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants, are really not in conflict and can be very easily reconciled.
And before we let you go and we turn a little bit more to politics, although some people would argue that it's been politics throughout this conversation, but for 4 years, I imagine that you and your colleagues have been largely focused on stopping policies from being put in place. In this new political environment, what is your sense of the political possibility that the policies you advocate for will be advanced?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I do think it feels like a really new day, both obviously with the Biden administration, but also with Congress. I would say folks like Lindsey Graham, who used to be on the bipartisan immigration train, he was part of the Gang of Eight in 2013, had a kind of 4-year, maybe amnesia, we could call it, in terms of being pro-immigrant. All of a sudden, without Trump in office, is now back to talking about wanting to sit down and pass something like the DREAM Act for young undocumented immigrants. So I think we're really in a new day. I would say we have probably 3 avenues of possibility. So one is that Congress will likely take up some of the bills they've talked about or passed, at least through one house in the past. These are things like the DREAM Act, things like the American Dream and Promise Act in the House, which includes not just dreamers, but people with temporary protected status. This is a temporary status that people have been here for 3 decades from countries like El Salvador, Haiti, Syria, etc. That would put them on a pathway to citizenship. I think that's very likely. There's also a bill for farm workers in there that would do the same thing, put them on a pathway to citizenship. So that's one. The second avenue that I think is really possible is we're seeing a growing recognition of the role that undocumented workers have done as essential workers during the pandemic. So 5 million undocumented immigrants have been putting their lives on the line to do everything from, work in hospitals, keeping people healthy, to frankly protecting our food supply and making sure that, Americans have food on their table, even in the middle of a pandemic. And they've done that at great risk to themselves. And so I think there's a good possibility that Congress recognizes these workers and also puts them on a pathway to citizenship. And then, of course, the third avenue is that President Biden has put forth his own immigration reform proposal that would really deal with all aspects of the system. And, I think we'll have a real debate about actually fixing many of the things that have been broken, not just during the Trump administration, but for decades before.
Certainly. Well, there is hope again, for us now after these last 4 years of, I don't even know what that was. It was something I hope we never have to live through again, though. Philip Wolgin, Managing Director of Immigration Policy at American Progress, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Phil, great speaking with you. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Ohio Representative Tim Ryan on why President Biden needs to hold the line on his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package and what needs to happen after that.
Do you think this stimulus is the right size, too big, not big enough? And what about the size of the checks that should be in it?
Yeah, I'm glad that the vice president's not backing down on the $1,400, which would make the $600 and the $1,400, $2,000 payment. I personally believe that we need to get a couple $1,000s into people's hands every month until we get out of this. I mean, I know so many people that continue to work, but make half of what they were making. The economic squeeze is real, and I think it could be, very, very good for the economy. So I think that would be my preference. Having said that, I think getting close to $2 trillion to take care of people is a big deal. Given the numbers, the narrow numbers in the House and the Senate, I think the help for state and local governments, the help for small businesses, the help for the one-time payment and the extension of unemployment insurance and making the federal payment about $500 a week. There's, I think, $25 or $30 billion that's going to be slated for issues around housing. So, and rent, so that people don't get evicted, and utilities and all of that. So I think it's a very comprehensive bill. It's going to do a lot of good. It's DC. Nothing's going to be perfect, and nothing's going to be all what I want. But it is significant, and I think it will be very helpful.
Do you think the minimum wage should be part of it, raising to $15?
To me, it's like I believe in a $15 minimum wage, so you want to get it in whenever you can. It doesn't sound like it's going to necessarily make it, and I do think we have to be careful on how we run it up, how we move it from where it is now to where it needs to be. Given that so many small businesses are under a complete crunch right now, and hanging, by a thread to even survive. So we've got to be careful on how we do that. And then I also think we need to have regional accommodations. I mean, $15 in New York City is not even enough, and $15 in rural Ohio or rural Mississippi, could be difficult for some businesses to juggle. So how do we help facilitate this with some of these regional disparities? And helping these small businesses be able to afford it. I think that nuance has got to be accounted for.
For the Republicans, it seems that one of the big sticking points has been help to the states, cities and states, but particularly the states. And yet, you sort of can't get on top of COVID without helping the states, right?
Yeah, it's unreal. I mean, the former president's comment always was, these are blue cities, right. or we're not here to bail out states' pension funds, which was just, those were red herrings that were put up, just to distract. And no state was going to get CARES Act money or HEROES Act money or COVID money and put it towards their pension. It wasn't even for that. They couldn't do that if they wanted. It was directly targeted. So these states, they need help. I mean, we know we're seeing budget cuts here in Ohio because the lack of revenue coming in for so many of the local governments and state governments. And what are those cuts to? Those are cuts to police and fire, safety service, teachers. Those are the people who bear the brunt of a reduction in income tax money going into the coffers.
And House Democrats have put forth a new, pretty bold proposal, too, just this week, Congressman, of $3,000 for families, American families, per year, every child in America, something that even Mitt Romney in the Senate has proposed. Is this part of the stimulus thing or on top of it? And what do you think the chances are?
I don't know if it's going to be a part of the broader package. I was reading articles about it. I think it's really important because there are these families that are really, really struggling with childcare. If you're working at home, your kids are at home, or you got to go to work, but your kids are doing virtual from home schooling. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of additional burdens on families. But I think this is well overdue in the United States. And so I'm hopeful, however we can get it passed, whether we can put it into the COVID package or not. I don't know how that procedurally is going to work, but I know the House is very, very committed to doing it. And again, this is for kids. This is for working class families. I think it's phased out over $150,000 a year. So it really is targeted to those families who are working hard, playing by the rules, doing everything right, but they need a little help, and help is on the way.
That has been one of the big conversations about this stimulus package, Congressman, which is how do you define middle class, right? I mean, where do you cut it off? I mean, you are very much represent working class families, working class Americans, Youngstown, Ohio, right? What do you think is the cutoff, right, for if you're talking about middle class American families today?
It's again like we've got to be sophisticated enough in the United States to identify these regional disparities. Again, if you're making $150,000 and you live in New York City, or you live in San Francisco, or you live in LA, or you live in Boston, or a variety of other cities, you're barely keeping your nose above water with $150,000 a year for a household. Where if you're living in Youngstown, Ohio, or Milwaukee, or some other place, $150,000 is a good solid lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to this all kind of gets back to a bigger theme we got to start addressing is when we talk about the government needs updated. Going back to Bill Clinton and Al Gore, like we need a reinventing government. I mean, we can't continue to just think there's one size fits all for everything that we do. We've got to modernize the government. I mean, look at these unemployment fiascos that are going on around getting checks out to people around this country, different states. Now, there's people in Ohio still haven't gotten their unemployment check. I mean, it's insane how we don't know who needs it and we can't quickly turn it around in a modern age. I mean, you can get 15 boxes shipped to your house within 2 days from Amazon, and you can't get an unemployment check, or you can't get help when you're unemployed in the middle of a pandemic. So when you're talking about minimum wage and the disparities, when you're talking about unemployment insurance, when you're talking about, some of these, thresholds for programs, we've got to be a little more sophisticated today. And I would hope that Democrats, this has been my frustration for a long time. I think that Republicans consistently bash the government, and they've won this argument over the last 40 years, that government can't do anything right. Then they defund it to make sure that it doesn't do anything right. And then sometimes I wish the Democrats would just stop defending the status quo. Like, we could defend the values of a program. We could defend the principles behind the program and the end results, but we're still not delivering, for the American people like we should. And that means we've got to have a huge modernization and imagination around government programs and how they work and how effective they actually are. Some are very effective, some aren't. But it's got to be a more sophisticated operation today than it has been in the past.
And make it work better. So the big question in the Senate, back to on the overall stimulus, Congressman, you got the votes in the House. In the Senate, it's going to be a lot tougher. And the question there is, okay, do we take our time to try to line up Republican support, make it a bipartisan bill, or do we just, go right forward and barge through reconciliation? What's your advice?
Well, my problem, Bill, is I have the scars from 2009 and 10, and Mitch McConnell trying to make Barack Obama a one-term president, and watching the Republicans slow walk the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
So there's not a lot of trust there. And I think that the vice president the president now, what he's doing is correct. We need $1.9 trillion, and we've got to do it because that's what's needed. And we're not going to just compromise the right solution with the idea of trying to build unity. There will be a lot of other issues we can work on with Republicans. If they want to try to do what they did last time and make this not significant enough, if they're all of a sudden going to be fiscal conservatives and fiscal hawks after the atrocious record they have over the last 4 years, you can let them go try to do that. But at the end result, you got to deliver for the American people. And I think this bill will allow us to deliver for the American people. And I hope that we follow this up with another $1.5 or $2 trillion in infrastructure spending, start rebuilding the country, get everybody back to work, and get the economy going. And I think, they can get on board with that. And so there'll be other opportunities to work with them. But if they're going to get in the way, we need to do the reconciliation, pass the $1.9 trillion, and get that relief to the American people. And then they will reward Joe Biden and Democrats because we delivered for them when they needed it. And they will see the Republicans as trying to get in the way of that.
It is ironic to see the sudden born-again fiscal conservatives, right?
I know.
Yeah. Where have they been? But you just mentioned a word before we move on that I haven't heard. We heard a lot about in the beginning of the Trump administration, and they forgot about it, and that is infrastructure. By the way, the need has not gone away, has it? And is there a chance now, you think, to come together on rebuilding America's infrastructure?
I do. I think, once we get the vaccine up and running and distributed more effectively and get the COVID package out so people have their unemployment and all the rest, I think we need to move on infrastructure this summer and, maybe late spring, summer, and into the fall and get that money out the door. We've got we got to modernize the country. We got to rebuild the country. And we've let this pass for decades now. And it's nobody's fault that the wear and tear on our nation's infrastructure. And that includes water lines and sewer lines, rail, airports. We need to be a modern country. And we can do that. And I think it could be a huge stimulus for the economy, create, millions of jobs for middle-class people. And then I think we actually need an extended, infrastructure investment where every year we're putting money into our nation's infrastructure. So in 5, 10, 15 years, we are consistently keeping people working, but they're not working in jobs that are handouts. They're working to rebuild the country. Broadband, we're seeing what the digital divide and how significant it is for rural communities and urban communities for kids now trying to learn from home. What a big disadvantage they're at. Those are investments that will make 10 times for every dollar we lay out for things like broadband because of the economic impact. And now you look at more and more people that want to locate their businesses outside of the big commercial real estate properties in big cities. That opens up so many small and mid-sized towns across the country for economic investment. But if they don't have broadband and high-speed internet and all the rest, they're not going to be on the menu for those companies who are looking to go somewhere. I mean, you think about it, not to get on a complete rant here, but I represent enough small little towns and villages that a company that with backroom, operations for a major company, 100, 200, 300 decent paying jobs is a huge shot in the arm for a small town. It increases their general revenue. The school district makes money. So to disperse and diffuse some of these huge investments, private investments to small and mid-sized towns across the country would be significant in rebuilding the middle class. I think we should do something with government jobs. There's 300,000 government jobs in Washington, D.C., and you got high housing prices, you got crowded street roads, and I think why couldn't you take 10% of those jobs and now do them virtually and put 500 of them in Youngstown, Ohio, or 1,000 in Toledo of people making 60, 70, 80 grand a year? that would be a huge shot in the arm for these towns. And so you could put 1,000 jobs in 30 towns or 500 jobs in 60 different towns across the country and start rebuilding. And the government should take the lead on that.
Bill Press with Ohio Representative Tim Ryan. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Cooper, Philip Wolgin, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.